She let the man and his child in to shelter them from the rain, but she didn't know who was hiding behind his quiet gaze, and what happened next changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are from. The rain had been threatening since morning, heavy clouds pressing low over the neighborhood, and by the time evening arrived, the sky finally released itself in steady gray sheets. Emily Carter sat quietly by the small window of her narrow attic room, the book in her lap only half read. She had lost track of the story on the page because her mind kept circling the same thoughts she carried every day. The house she lived in was not hers, though it had once been her father's. After his death, everything had shifted. The walls that once felt like a safe embrace now seemed to press closer with every passing week, and the rooms echoed not with warmth, but with the clipped words of her stepmother and the mocking laughter of her stepsister. Downstairs earlier, the air had smelled of perfume and hairspray, the kind that clung long after the women left. Caroline, her stepmother, had been parading across the living room in a floor-length gown, every inch of her calculated to impress. Madison, her daughter, twirled in front of the mirror in a sequined dress chosen carefully for the evening's event. Both women had been preparing for a private gala at one of the city's exclusive clubs, a place where money, power, and appearances mingled in carefully staged harmony. They had barked at Emily throughout the afternoon, demanding that she fetch a shawl, iron a silk hem, or hold a mirror at just the right angle. She had complied without protest because protest was never welcomed. When the limousine finally arrived at the gate, its headlights glowing pale through the drizzle, Caroline and Madison swept out of the house as though they were royalty, leaving the scent of luxury behind them. Emily had stood at the bottom of the stairs watching quietly as the driver opened the door for them. For a brief second, she saw her reflection in the hall mirror. A young woman in worn jeans and a stretched sweater, pale hair pulled back loosely, nothing in her appearance hinting at the sparkle that surrounded the other two. She had turned away quickly, ashamed of her own comparison. The slam of the front door had sealed the emptiness. Now, in the quiet aftermath, the house felt hollow. The silence was not peaceful, but oppressive. Emily leaned her forehead against the cool window pane, listening to the rain patter against the glass. It was the kind of evening that pressed against the heart, heavy and gray, reminding her of how small her world had become. She opened her book again, trying to focus, but the words blurred. Outside, the street lamps flickered against the sheets of rain, and the pavement gleamed as though polished by silver. The houses on either side seemed to retreat into the storm, their windows glowing faintly like faraway stars. Her eyes caught movement at the corner of the street. At first she thought it was the wind sweeping branches along the sidewalk, but then she saw them clearly. A man and a small girl, both without umbrellas, trudging slowly through the downpour. The man held a bag over one shoulder, his other hand gripping the child's tightly. The girl, no older than 6, was soaked through, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her little shoes splashing into puddles. They had no shelter, no cover, only determination carrying them forward. Something inside Emily stirred, a sharp pang of recognition. She knew what it felt like to be unprotected in a world that offered no kindness. Before she could second-guess herself, she moved quickly down the narrow stairs, her heart beating fast. She opened the front door, the rush of wet air hitting her skin. "Come in," she called, her voice steadier than she expected. The man stopped, surprised, then ushered the little girl toward the light spilling from the doorway. They stepped into the hall, dripping water onto the rug. Emily shut the door firmly behind them, shutting out the storm. She didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate. She guided them toward the living room, where the embers from the fire earlier still faintly glowed. With quick, practiced movements, she set to work, pulling towels from the linen cupboard, setting a kettle on the stove, and rummaging for dry blankets. The little girl sat silently on the couch, shivering, until Emily draped a towel over her shoulders. Slowly the child's eyes lifted, wide and brown, curious but not afraid. The man murmured his thanks, his voice low, carrying a quiet weight. He seemed reserved, cautious, but his gaze followed Emily with something between relief and wonder, as if he had not expected kindness from a stranger. His coat was dark and heavy, now soaked through, and he set it aside without ceremony. Beneath the damp fabric, His figure was lean, steady, suggesting both strength and fatigue. When Emily returned with tea, the steam rising in thin curls, she caught the smallest smile on the girl's lips as she wrapped her hands around the warm cup. It was the kind of smile that lifted her face and made her seem less fragile, and Emily felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. She could not remember the last time anyone had looked at her that way, with unguarded gratitude, unspoken trust. The fire crackled to life as she added fresh logs, filling the room with flickering light. Shadows danced across the walls, chasing away the earlier emptiness. The house no longer seemed hollow. It was alive again, but not because of the wealth Caroline and Madison flaunted. It was alive because of this quiet, unassuming moment, and a man and his daughter finding warmth on a night that might have broken them. Emily settled into the armchair across from them, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She felt out of place in her own home, worried that at any moment Carolyn and Madison might burst in and demand an explanation. But they would not return until late, and for once Emily allowed herself to breathe. The storm outside raged on, battering against the windows, but inside the air softened. The girl, wrapped in a blanket, leaned against her father's arm, her eyes beginning to close. Emily watched silently, a flicker of longing passing through her. She had no memories like this with Caroline, no moments of safety or belonging. Even with her father, love had been brief, cut short by his passing. Now, watching this child surrender to rest under her father's steady presence, Emily felt something both painful and comforting. She wanted to keep them safe, at least for this one night. The man's eyes lifted to hers across the room. There was no demand, no question, only a shared understanding. In that silent exchange, Emily sensed that he recognized her loneliness as much as she recognized his. They did not need words. The quiet, the fire, the rain, and the fragile thread of trust between them spoke enough. As the evening stretched into night, Emily's heart felt strangely light. She had not imagined that such an ordinary act, opening a door, offering tea, could change the atmosphere of an entire house. For the first time in years, the walls did not feel like a prison. They felt like shelter. She knew the moment was temporary, a fragile reprieve, but she held on to it as tightly as the little girl clutched her blanket. When they finally left, stepping back into the storm with dry clothes and warmer hearts, Emily stood at the door watching them go. The rain swallowed them quickly, but their presence lingered in the warmth of the room and in the ache in her chest. She closed the door softly and leaned against it, her eyes closing. For a fleeting moment, she had felt what it was like to matter. She returned to her attic room, but she carried with her a memory she knew she would not easily forget. The night stretched long, and though she tried to sleep, Emily lay awake listening to the storm. Her thoughts returned again and again to the look in the man's eyes, the smile of the little girl, and the fragile thread of connection that had formed in the most unlikely of circumstances. She did not yet know his name, nor what place he might have in her future. But she knew, with a certainty she could not explain, that something had shifted. The rain continued to fall, but inside her, a new silence took root, not empty, but expectant, as though waiting for the next chapter of her life to unfold. The storm passed by morning, leaving the streets slick with silver reflections and the air sharp with the smell of wet earth. Emily rose early, as she always did, to sweep the kitchen and prepare breakfast for a family that rarely acknowledged her work. The echoes of the previous night lingered in her chest, a warmth she carried silently as she moved about the empty house. She could still see the man's face, serious and calm, and the little girl's hesitant smile as she had warmed by the fire. It felt like a dream, something too fragile to share. She tucked it away deep inside herself, guarding it as though it might vanish if spoken aloud. The days that followed slipped into their usual rhythm. Caroline and Madison spent hours away from home, moving through their social circles, shopping, and preening for gatherings that seemed endless. Emily stayed behind, cleaning rooms she was never invited to use, scrubbing dishes that bore no gratitude, and folding clothes she could never afford. Yet each night when she lay in her attic room, her mind returned to the memory of the storm. She could not explain why the memory clung to her so fiercely. Perhaps it was because, for the first time in years, Someone had looked at her without disdain or indifference. Perhaps it was because she had felt, however briefly, that she belonged in her own home. It was not long before the man returned. Several days had passed when the doorbell rang one afternoon, just as Caroline and Madison were preparing to leave for another social event. Emily was upstairs, bent over the laundry, when she heard the chime. She assumed it was another courier or delivery and continued with her work. But Caroline's voice drifted upward, cool and practiced, speaking to someone at the door. When Emily came down a few minutes later to carry out a basket of folded linen, she glimpsed him through the entryway. He was standing in the hall, coat neatly pressed this time, rein absent from his shoulders. His presence filled the space with quiet authority. In his hand he carried a bouquet of pale flowers, simple and unassuming, and beside him, the little girl clutched a folded drawing. Emily froze at the edge of the stairs, her heart leaping into her throat. She wanted to step forward to call out, but Caroline turned sharply, blocking his view of the staircase. Her stepmother's voice was honeyed in a way Emily rarely heard, dripping with false warmth. She insisted that Emily was not home, that she had left suddenly, perhaps even gone away for good. Madison appeared at her mother's side, already dressed in a pale silk gown, her hair styled to perfection. She smiled sweetly, introducing herself, her eyes lingering on the flowers with unmistakable hunger. Emily's breath caught as she realized what was happening. They were lying. They were trying to steal what had not even had the chance to belong to her. The man frowned slightly, though he said nothing. He glanced around the entryway, as though expecting Emily to appear, but Caroline's smooth reassurances filled the silence. Madison leaned toward him, speaking quickly, offering tea, trying to draw his gaze. He remained polite, but distant. At his side, the little girl tugged at his sleeve, whispering words Emily could not hear. Her hand gripped the drawing tightly, her face full of quiet disappointment. Emily's chest ached with the effort of holding herself still, of not rushing down the stairs and breaking through the web of lies spun around her. But she stayed hidden. She had learned long ago that in this house her voice was drowned before it reached the air. From her narrow place at the edge of the landing, she watched as Caroline eventually ushered him back to the door, Madison's eyes flashing with calculation. The door closed, the echo of it reverberating through Emily like a blow. She sank down onto the step, her folded linen forgotten, her hands trembling. For a brief moment, she had believed that kindness could be enough, that the warmth of one evening could carry forward into something more. Now it seemed snatched away, stolen before it had even begun. In the days that followed, Caroline and Madison spoke little of the visit, though Emily overheard fragments. Caroline was determined to redirect his attention to Madison, speaking of connections, opportunities, and alliances. She treated Emily with even sharper cruelty, as though punishing her for being seen at all. Emily endured it in silence, but at night lying awake, she replayed the moment at the top of the stairs. She remembered the girl's disappointed eyes, the way she had clutched her paper as though it were the only thing that mattered. She wondered what picture she had drawn and whether it had been meant for her. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Nathan Blake struggled with unease. He had returned to the house expecting gratitude, perhaps a simple conversation, but instead had been met with polished falsehood. He could not reconcile the girl who had opened her home with the dismissive story he was told. Something in Caroline's practiced smile had unsettled him. The young woman he remembered from the storm had not seemed the type to vanish without a word. Her presence had been too genuine, too deeply rooted in sincerity. He thought of her often, though he tried not to. Work filled his days as it always did. But in the quiet moments, his thoughts returned to her face by the fire, the tenderness in her voice when she had spoken to his daughter, the way she had made a house of strangers feel suddenly like a home. Sophia, his daughter, made forgetting impossible. She spoke of Emily constantly, asking when they would see her again, wondering aloud why she had disappeared. She carried the ribbon Emily had used to tie her hair that night, keeping it close, refusing to let it go. Each time she asked, Nathan felt a sting of guilt. He wanted to explain, but how could he tell a child that sometimes the world turned cruel without reason? How could he admit that he, too, longed for the presence of someone who had seemed, even in a fleeting evening, to understand them both? For Emily, the days became heavier. Her work at the diner near the station gave her some relief, a chance to exist beyond the suffocating reach of Caroline and Madison. Yet even there, as she wiped down counters and carried plates, her mind wandered. She wondered if he had believed the lies, if he had dismissed her as easily as Caroline wished. She told herself it was better this way, that she had no place in a life like his. Still in her heart, the memory of Sophia's trusting gaze refused to fade. The house that had felt like a prison now seemed worse, for she had glimpsed another possibility, only to have it locked away. Each time Madison returned from her outings, speaking casually of new acquaintances and prospects, Emily's stomach tightened. She feared what her sister and stepmother might do if the man returned again, feared that he might be drawn into their world of pretense. The thought made her chest ache with a strange combination of jealousy and despair. Natan, however, was not so easily swayed. Though outwardly he allowed Caroline's words to pass, inwardly he held on to doubt. He recalled the simplicity of Emily's kindness, the uncalculated way she had opened her door. He recognized the falseness in Caroline's tone, the eagerness in Madison's smile. In his world, built on business negotiations and practiced courtesies, he had learned to sense dishonesty. And what he had encountered at that doorway was not truth. Still, uncertainty lingered. He did not know her name, not fully, nor how to find her again. All he had was the memory of her face illuminated by firelight, and his daughter's unshakable insistence that she had found a friend worth keeping. It was enough to keep him restless, enough to keep him searching quietly in his thoughts for a way back to her. For Emily, the days stretched on in muted colors. She continued her work, endured her stepfamily's cruelty, and kept her secret memory alive. She did not know that across the city, Natan too was unsettled, his mind returning again and again to the night of the storm. She did not know that Sophia whispered her name to herself before falling asleep, clutching the ribbon in her small hands. And so, as the weeks turned, both carried the same weight. A fleeting encounter that had sparked something more, now threatened by lies and silence. Yet beneath the surface, something remained. The thread of that night, fragile though it was, had not broken. It lingered, stretched across distance and deception, waiting for the moment when truth would find its way through the cracks. Neither Emily nor Natan could know it then, but the story was not over. The storm that had brought them together had left its mark, and even as they walked apart, its echo followed, promising a meeting not so easily stolen. The winter days rolled on with a heaviness that neither Emily nor Natan could shake. After that second thwarted encounter, the world seemed to return to its gray rhythm, but under the surface something had shifted in both of them. Emily resumed her routine of quiet labor, washing dishes in the diner near the station, scrubbing tables until her hands grew red, and returning to a house where she was invisible. Yet in her mind there lingered the vision of a little girl clutching a drawing, eyes bright with hope, and a man whose silence seemed to carry more honesty than any words her stepfamily had ever spoken. She tried to convince herself that it had been nothing more than a fleeting kindness, a moment meant to disappear like the storm itself, but the ache in her chest refused to fade. Each night when she climbed into her narrow bed beneath the slanted roof of the attic, she thought of Sophia's laughter, that sudden light that had burst through the gloom of a stormy evening. She thought of the way Natan had stood in her living room, his presence both weary and strong, and the gentleness with which he had guided his daughter's hand. These thoughts came uninvited, circling her heart until she drifted into uneasy sleep. The house around her remained the same, cold and hostile, but inside her there was a strange, persistent warmth, fragile yet undeniable. Natan, meanwhile, found himself restless in ways he had not been for years. He had built his life upon structure and discipline, raising his daughter with quiet devotion, steering his business with focus, never allowing himself the indulgence of dreams. Yet since that night, his thoughts betrayed him. He remembered the young woman who had opened her door without hesitation, who had offered warmth without calculation. He remembered how natural she had been with Sophia, how easily the child had trusted her. He could not reconcile that memory with the polished lie he had been fed by Caroline. In boardrooms he had learned to read faces, to sense falsehood beneath charm, and everything in Caroline's demeanor had spoken of artifice. He knew with a certainty he could not explain that the truth had been hidden from him. Sophia, of course, made forgetting impossible. She spoke of Emily with the stubborn clarity only a child could have, asking why they had not gone back, wondering if they had done something wrong. She drew pictures of 3 figures under a roof, stick lines but bright with color, her own small hand holding the hand of the woman she had known for only an evening. Each time she showed them to her father, he felt his resolve deepen. Children did not fabricate trust. Sophia had felt something real, and so had he. The city carried on around them, bustling with the noise of winter markets and the hum of daily life. But for Natan, there was a quiet pull beneath it all. He found himself driving routes that took him past the neighborhood where she lived, scanning the sidewalks for a glimpse of pale hair, slowing near the diner she had mentioned in passing. Once he stepped inside, the bell over the door jangling, and asked quietly if a young woman named Emily worked there. The waitress behind the counter frowned, thinking, then nodded faintly. Yes, she said, sometimes. She was kind, always polite, always helping with the heavier work even when she did not need to. But she had not been in for several days. Natan thanked her, left a tip larger than the cost of a meal, and walked back into the cold with a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Emily, for her part, had avoided the diner deliberately. The memory of Caroline's triumph at the door haunted her, making her feel small and foolish. She believed Natan had left convinced of the lies, and the thought of facing him, of seeing indifference in his eyes, was more than she could bear. So she retreated further into herself, taking odd jobs in quieter corners of the city, folding laundry in a back room, wiping down shelves in a small grocery store. She thought anonymity might dull the ache, but each task only reminded her of how invisible she had become, how easy it was for her step-family to erase her existence. Still, she could not erase the memory of that child. Sophia's face returned to her again and again, the way she had leaned into Emily's arm as though it were the most natural place in the world. That trust had been real, and Emily carried it like a secret flame. She told herself it was selfish to hope, but she could not entirely extinguish the wish that they might find her again. Natan's search continued in small, quiet ways. He visited the library on Main Street, where he asked after a young woman who might have come in often. The librarian smiled faintly, recalling someone who always left books carefully stacked, who once helped a boy find a lost glove. She had not seen her recently, but she remembered the gentleness. Each fragment he collected painted the same picture, a girl who gave more of herself than the world had ever given to her. He carried these pieces like a puzzle, each confirming what his instincts already told him, that she was not gone, merely hidden. It was Sophia who finally guided him to her. One evening, as the 3 of them walked home from the park, the little girl pointed at a corner store across the street. The lights were dim, the aisles nearly empty, and through the front window she spotted a familiar figure. "Daddy," she whispered urgently, tugging at his sleeve. "It's her." Natan's heart quickened. He followed his daughter's gaze, and there, bent over a mop, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair tied back hastily, was Emily. For a moment he did not move. He simply watched her, the ordinariness of the scene striking him with more force than any grand gesture could. She was working quietly, unnoticed, as though the world had no idea what it had overlooked. His chest tightened with something he had not felt in years, an ache of recognition, of longing, of a truth too plain to ignore. He stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing, and Emily froze. The mop slipped from her hands, clattering softly against the tiles. Her eyes widened, her breath catching as she stared at him and the small girl by his side. Sophia did not wait. She darted across the damp floor, arms flung wide, and pressed herself against Emily's waist. The child's voice trembled as she spoke, muffled against the fabric of Emily's sweater. She said she had dreamed of her, that she had been afraid she was gone, that she did not want her to leave again. Emily's arms closed around her instinctively, holding the small body close, her own hands shaking. She lowered her face, eyes stinging, whispering words even she did not fully hear. Natan stood a few paces away, rainwater still clinging to his coat from the walk, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, red-rimmed with sleeplessness, revealed what his voice had not yet spoken: relief gratitude, and something deeper he could not name. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to simply stand and witness a moment, unafraid of what it meant. Emily finally looked up, her gaze colliding with his. She seemed startled, almost ashamed, as though expecting rebuke. Her lips parted, but no explanation came. She could not bring herself to speak of Caroline's lies, of Madison's envy, of the years of silence that had trained her to believe she was unworthy of being chosen. She only held Sophia tighter, as though bracing against the inevitability of being torn away once more. But Natan did not move to separate them. He let the silence linger, heavy but not cruel, and in that silence there was a choice. Emily felt it, trembling under the weight of it, and Natan felt it too, his heart pounding with the realization that the woman he had met in the storm was not a fleeting apparition. She was real. She was here, and she had been hidden not by her own will, but by the cruelty of others. The hum of the store's refrigerators filled the pause. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the glass. Sophia clung to Emily as though the world might dissolve if she let go. And Emily, torn between fear and longing, closed her eyes for the briefest moment and allowed herself to imagine what it would mean not to be alone anymore. The evening stretched on in muted colors, the storm outside matching the storm within. Yet within that small grocery store, among shelves of canned goods and the faint smell of bleach, something unspoken passed between them. It was not yet a promise, nor a declaration. It was only the quiet recognition that the thread that had connected them had not broken after all. It had endured through silence and lies, and now against all odds, it had led them back to each other. The rain that had carried them together again lingered in the city for days, soft showers alternating with sudden bursts of sunlight, as though the sky itself could not decide whether to mourn or rejoice. Emily carried within her a similar uncertainty. After that evening in the grocery store, when Sophia had flung herself into her arms with such unshakable trust, nothing felt the same. She returned home to Caroline's house with the same quiet step, climbed to her attic room, and folded herself into the small space as though she belonged there. Yet the truth pressed against her ribs. She no longer belonged only to that silence. Something had shifted, and the world outside those walls no longer seemed so distant. Natan, too, found that his life no longer followed the strict order he had built for himself. He began to appear at the grocery store after Emily's shifts ended, waiting outside with Sophia so that they could walk her home. At first, Emily resisted, afraid of what the neighbors might say or what Caroline would do if she saw. But each time she stepped into the quiet street and saw Sophia's bright smile, her resistance melted. They would walk slowly through the dusky evenings, Sophia skipping between them, holding one hand in each of her own. Natan spoke little, but his silence was not heavy. It was steady, offering comfort simply in being near. Emily found herself answering questions she had never spoken aloud before, about her childhood, her memories of her father, her love of books, and her dream, secret and foolish as it seemed, of becoming a teacher one day. Caroline noticed the change quickly. She was not blind, and envy sharpened her gaze like glass. When Natan came to the house once, standing firmly at the door, Caroline answered with her most polished smile, insisting that Emily was unworthy of his company. Madison, dressed in finery, stepped forward eagerly, trying to dazzle him with charm. But Natan did not even glance at her. His words were calm, his gaze steady, and though he spoke little, it was clear that he was not a man to be swayed by mass. Caroline's false sweetness curdled into bitterness, and from that day her cruelty toward Emily grew sharper. She reminded her more often that she was a guest, that she had no place, that her presence in the house was tolerated only out of obligation. Yet Emily's heart had begun to change. The nights she once spent shrinking into herself were now filled with memories of Sophia's laughter, of the way the girl reached for her hand, as if it had always been hers to hold. Slowly she began to believe that perhaps she was not as invisible as Caroline had made her feel. When Sophia tugged at her sleeve and whispered that she wished Emily were her mother, Emily's chest ached with both longing and fear. She wanted to believe she was worthy of such a role, though years of silence and dismissal had taught her otherwise. Natan continued to appear, undeterred by Caroline's disapproval. He invited Emily and Sophia to meet him in the park on Sunday afternoons, where the child would weave flower crowns and place them crookedly on Emily's head. He would watch quietly, his heart softening at the sight of his daughter's laughter. For him, the truth had already taken root. The woman who had opened her door on a stormy night had brought something back into his life he had not realized he had lost. The possibility of family, whole and unbroken. The tension in Caroline's house built steadily. One evening, after Natan had walked Emily home, Caroline confronted her in the hall with a fury that made the walls tremble. She accused her of scheming, of trying to steal what should belong to Madison. Madison wept theatrically nearby, insisting that she had been robbed of her chance at a better life. Emily stood silently, the words striking her like blows, but for the first time she did not bend beneath them. She lifted her gaze, steady though her hands trembled, and felt within her a spark of defiance. She could no longer pretend that she was nothing. She had seen the way Sophia reached for her, the way Natan looked at her with quiet certainty, and those truths could not be erased by cruelty. The breaking point came days later, when Natan returned to the house once more. Caroline opened the door, ready with another mask of disdain, but this time he did not allow her performance. He asked for Emily directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made his decision. Caroline faltered, her false charm cracking, and Madison stood frozen in disbelief. When Emily appeared in the hallway, hesitant and pale, Natan's eyes softened. He did not need to say much. The choice was clear, made in the quiet conviction of his gaze. Caroline's protests filled the air, shrill and furious, but they were powerless. For once, Emily was not erased. She was seen. That night she left the house she had lived in for so long, the attic room she had called her own, shrinking behind her, as though it had been nothing more than a cage. She carried little with her, only a small bag, and the weight of years spent in silence. Yet as she stepped outside into the cool night, Sophia's hand slipped into hers, warm and sure, and she felt as though she were carrying everything she truly needed. Life did not transform overnight, but it began to unfold in a way Emily had never imagined. She found herself spending more time with Natan and Sophia, helping with schoolwork, cooking simple meals, and learning to laugh again. Sophia, free from the loneliness that had shadowed her, bloomed in Emily's care. She called her second mom at first in shy whispers, then simply Mom, when no one corrected her. Emily's heart trembled each time she heard it, not with fear but with gratitude. For Natan, each day only confirmed what he had felt from the beginning. He had met countless people in his world of business, women polished and ambitious, but none had given him what Emily had offered so simply: sincerity without condition. He found in her not only companionship, but truth, a reminder that love was not measured in appearances or wealth, but in the small, steady acts of care that built a home. The spring that followed was gentle, the city softening under new leaves and brighter skies. One afternoon they gathered in the park again, Sophia twirling with flowers in her hair, laughter ringing through the air. Natan and Emily walked side by side, their silence no longer heavy but easy, filled with a quiet understanding. When Sophia stumbled, Emily caught her with instinctive ease, holding her close until the child's giggles returned. Natan watched, his chest tightening with something that was no longer uncertainty, but certainty itself. Caroline and Madison, left behind in their house of mirrors, faded from Emily's life. Their anger no longer reached her. She had walked beyond their cruelty, carrying with her the only treasures she had ever needed: the trust of a child and the love of a man who saw her for who she was. In the months that followed, Emily no longer doubted her place. She moved into Natan's home, not as a guest or an intruder, but as someone who belonged. Sophia's drawings, once of 3 stick figures beneath a crooked roof, now hung on the refrigerator, replaced with brighter, fuller pictures. 3 figures holding hands beneath a sun, a house with wide windows, and the word family written in uneven letters. One evening, as twilight settled over the city, Emily sat by the window with Sophia nestled against her side. Natan entered the room quietly, watching them for a moment before joining them. He placed his hand gently over Emily's, his eyes steady, carrying no grand declarations, only the truth he had always known since the storm, that the woman who had once thought herself invisible had become the center of their world. Emily looked back at him, her heart no longer weighed down by doubt. For the first time in her life, she felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. And so the story that had begun with rain and shadows ended with warmth and light, not in the grand halls of wealth, but in the small, steady moments of love that built a home. Emily had opened her door to strangers one stormy night, never knowing that she was opening it to her own future. What she found was not just shelter from the rain, but a place she had long been searching for, a family, a belonging, and a home of her own. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And please share this video with your friends and family because some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.